Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm going to say just a few words of introduction about the Rambam, Maimonides, as he is known to the Latin world, one of the greatest thinkers in all times, and one of the most important, if not the most important thinker in Judaism, who has had a tremendous influence on shaping the world we live in, because throughout the Middle Ages, since his time, he influenced not only the Jewish people, but also very much both Christianity and Islam. We are, of course, more under the influence of his influence on Christianity. That means Europe would not have been what it became without the central influence of Maimonides. Our shiur is not about that, but I'm saying this just as a matter of introduction. How is my English until now?
Very good.
Okay, if I use words which need to be explained or anything, or if you want me to go over to a different language, we can try that. Something about the biography of the Rambam. So his time is the 12th century. He was born into a family of one of the greatest families of rabbis in Cordoba, in Muslim Spain, and he always signs himself, or most often, as Hasfaradi, the Spanish, the Sephardi, and it is important to him because the whole Jewish culture of Sepharad is very much where he comes from. And again, that's not our topic, but I'm mentioning it. The Rambam was apparently orphaned relatively early in life. We know some details, and some details we don't know too much about. I mean, about his life in general. But we know relatively a lot. We know that in his teens, his family, that means his father, maybe mother, and his brother and whoever was in the family fled Spain because of the Almohads who took over. The Almohads were fundamentalist Muslims who were very intolerant and persecuted physically and also killed multitudes of people who were not Muslim, amongst them many Jews. And like many other Jews, they fled, and they eventually landed in Morocco, in Fez, where you can still see the house where he lived. When he was 17, he wrote his first book. It was a kind of glossary of philosophical terms. Then in Fez, he wrote his first very great book by which he is very well known, one of the most classical for which he's known, and that is the Pirush HaMishnayot, his Pirush on the whole Mishnah, which is very interesting. Although other Pirushim have been written until now, this is still one of the most important references in Mishnah, in Pirush HaMishnah. That is in his 20s. Then they moved over from Fez. Apparently, they had been believed to have converted to Islam, and maybe because of that they had to flee. Anyway, they ended up here in Eretz Israel, and the Rambam tells in detail about each place where he was in Eretz Israel and exactly on which date, in Yerushalayim, in Hebron. He traveled through Eretz Israel, although it was dangerous. It was under the Crusaders. But they couldn't stay here, and he moved over to Egypt. So now we are in his 30s. In Egypt, he was the doctor of the ruler, maybe Saladin, at least for sure his successor. That means he was the doctor of the most important ruler of the time. He was also the head of the Jewish community in Egypt. First he teaching philosophy in the university, that means the Arab University in Alexandria, Egypt. And then he became the head of the Beddin of Cairo. So he was the leader of the Egyptian Jewry, and he was a leader of many other Jewish communities or Jews who sent him letters and asked him questions. Some of these letters are very well known until today, like the letter to Yemen and the letter to Provence, to the Chachmei Lunel. He, in this time in Egypt, around his 40s, that's when he wrote his most important work, the Mishneh Torah, the all-encompassing work of halakha, which goes from basic faith and ethics all the way through all of the most technical issues in halakha. In other words, encompassing all of Judaism, all of the way of life. That's around his 40s. Around his 50s, he wrote this book, The Guide to the Perplexed, or as he called it in Arabic, Guidance to the Perplexed, or to the wanderers, people who are looking for a way. So he wrote Mishneh Torah, he wrote in Hebrew, in a beautiful Hebrew, as it is known as Lashon HaZahav, the golden tongue. Very, very thought out, beautiful language. But the Perush HaMishnayot, as well as this, the Moreh Nevuchim, he wrote in Arabic. That means in Hebrew characters, in Arabic. In Arabic that a Jew would understand, because a lot of Hebrew words are in it, a lot of words from Talmudic literature are in it. So, and it's written in Hebrew characters, so obviously an Arab would have had to translate it, to have it translated in order to understand it. So he wrote it for Jews, and most Jews at the time were Arabic speaking. In his lifetime already, Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibon translated, in Provence, in southern France, translated the Moreh Nevuchim into Hebrew. And because of that, he was in correspondence with the Rambam, because he had questions about words, how exactly to translate. So these were a few words about the Rambam and about this book. Now, he starts out by saying words about this, about what he's going to write, to his disciple, who is the addressee of this book. This is where we are starting. To the pupil Rabbi Yosef ibn Aknin. I always have reticence when I read any classical text in a translation, because it always does it wrong necessarily. I mean, in the name of God, Lord of the universe, sounds so Western, so Christian maybe even. While if you read it in the Hebrew, it's B'Shem Hashem El Olam. It's the words of Avraham Avinu, who Vayikra B'Shem Hashem El Olam. He built a mizbeach, an altar, and he called in the name of Hashem, God of the world. Okay, so in the name of God, Lord of the universe, to Rabbi Yosef, I'm reading it in the English with your permission. Unless you prefer me to read it in the Hebrew.
English.
In the English, okay. So he's saying to him, ever since you resolved to come to me from a distant country to study under my direction, what that means is the practice that was at the time that a disciple, somebody who wanted to learn from a great master, he came to him, he read in front of him a specific text, a classical text. If it's a mathematical text, if it's medical, whether it's philosophical, whatever he wanted to study. So he would read those texts, usually normally translated into Arabic from the original Greek texts, like Aristotle or others. And he would read, and if the master had anything to say, he would comment. And that's the way he learned from the master. That was simply the practice. So that's what he says, to read in front of me, or to read from me. Yeah, although here it's translated as to study under my direction. I thought highly of your thirst for knowledge and your fondness for speculative pursuits. Speculative pursuits means subjects of introspection. That's what it means, really, of looking into an issue and thinking about it sincerely, which found expression in your poems. So now we know that his disciple was also dealing with poetry. In other words, he had a mastery of language, and he also dealt with that. I refer to the time when I received your writings in prose and verse from Alexandria. So he had been studying with him, and then he had received, at a certain time, he wasn't there anymore physically, but he sent him prose and verse from Alexandria. Now he's writing to him, probably somewhat to somewhere else. But anyway, he came from a very far away country, not from Alexandria. I was then not yet able to test your powers of apprehension. And I thought that your desire might possibly exceed your capacity. So I understand you were eager to learn, but I wasn't yet sure how much you had the capacity of understanding.
This is the Rambam.
The Rambam speaking to this disciple, for whom he wrote this whole book to start with. So he's telling him the truth as it was. I knew you at the time, I knew you had eagerness, but I wasn't sure. Shalom, good morning. But I wasn't yet sure that you were able to go in depth in issues. In other words, what the Rambam is expecting from somebody who learns is a real capacity, not just being eager, but a capacity to understand issues in depth. But when you had gone with me through a course of astronomy, after having completed the elementary studies, which are indispensable for the understanding of that science, I was still more gratified by the acuteness and the quickness. I was still more gratified by the acuteness and the quickness of your apprehension. In other words, then I understood how sharp a mind you had, and how you were acutely able to understand things. Observing your great fondness for mathematics, I let you study them more deeply, for I felt sure of your ultimate success. Okay, so we're talking already now about two sciences, two of the 7 sciences that were accepted in this whole time since antiquity, and that is astronomy is one of them, and mathematics. And the Rambam says throughout his book that you can't get to divine science, which is another science, metaphysics as we call it, without having studied before that other sciences, all the other sciences, like mathematics. You can't get to divine before knowing astronomy and mathematics. Yeah, yeah. That's a clear thing for the Rambam. So here he's talking to him about how he saw about his astronomy, his knowledge, his understanding of astronomy, his eagerness to study, because it's not enough that you have a lot of understanding, that you know a lot. You have to be eager to study. And so astronomy and mathematics. And of course, astronomy and mathematics, we should remember, are extremely intertwined in this period because there are no telescopes. So all of astronomy basically is just mathematics. Yeah, it's based on mathematics. So, observing your great fondness for mathematics, I let you study them more deeply, for I felt sure of your ultimate success. Afterwards, when I took you through a course of logic, that's yet another of the 7 sciences, logic, I found that my great expectations of you were confirmed, and I considered you fit to receive from me an exposition of the esoteric ideas contained in the prophetic books, that you might understand them as they are understood by men of culture. Okay? Now, to understand this phrase is extremely important to understand the whole of Maimonides' way of thinking, his whole approach, his whole philosophy, because what he's saying is, when I took you through a course of logic, I found that my great expectations of you were confirmed, and I considered you fit to receive from me an exposition of the esoteric ideas contained in the prophetic books, that you might understand them as they are understood by men of culture. Okay? Now, this is so not modern, because today people would say, esoteric, what's that got to do with science? Prophetics, words of prophets, to understand prophecy, understood by men of culture. Men of culture despise prophecy, don't they? That's what a person today would react, I think, more or less. Now, what the Rambam is saying is, after you studied logic, when I saw your capacity for understanding logic, then I knew you were able to go to the next stage, and that you would understand the esoterics and words of prophets, which are only understood by men of culture. Okay? You can't get to understanding prophecy if you haven't studied logic. Not only is this not what a modern person would understand, it is at the time very much not what a Muslim would understand. When I say Muslim, I'm talking about the prevailing culture of the time, especially in the Rambam's world. I mean, in Rashi's world, the prevailing culture was the Germanic Christians of the time. But, you know, men of culture didn't look at them. They were like beyond the pale. Men of culture spoke Arabic. Men of culture knew Islamic philosophy. That's the time we're talking about. Just as a scientist today wouldn't really consider too important. I don't know, maybe something like somebody looks in a crystal ball or something like that. I mean, the Germanic culture that was geographically and culturally just on the fringes of the world, kind of. The world of culture were the great Islamic universities from the Maghreb and Spain to Cairo and Baghdad and Persia. Those were the centers of culture, and it's in this world that the Rambam is acting. And he's talking about men of culture who understand prophetics, because you have studied logic in a context of I'm not an expert on Islam, so I'm saying this by the way because it's important to understand the context. In a context in which this whole religion, Islam, is based on the prophecy. It's based on prophecy, basically. Yeah? But who is the prophet? An uncultured man. He is somebody who became prophet through God's will, who just, boom, came down and made him into a prophet. Islam says this clearly. He was illiterate. And he suddenly began prophesying. That means this is what shows that he is a true prophet. The fact that God gave him the prophecy, because we know he was illiterate. Now, what I'm saying now is a spoiler, because there's a very central part of Moreh Nevuchim in which he explains prophecy. And there he says clearly, you cannot be a prophet if you're stupid. You cannot be a prophet if you're illiterate, if you're ignorant. You have to be a sage in order to be a prophet. So that goes clearly against the whole basis of Islam.
Is he assuming then that devout Muslims are not going to read this work or censor it? Or get him in hot water?
Are you assuming? You're asking about what he is assuming. I'm asking what you're assuming. You're assuming that the Rambam writes something with the thought of who will read it and might it cause him problems. The Rambam knew problems and persecution. He had to travel because of them, and he was under threat of death more than once in his life. And these dangers came from Islam. When he wrote his letter to Yemen, in which he speaks clearly against Muhammad, against the Prophet of Islam, which is capital punishment for Islam, and he says, read out this letter in all the synagogues. But he also says in this letter, don't talk about it to people who are not of our faith, because it can bring you into danger and it can bring me into danger, and don't do it. And we have to believe that apparently nobody did it. Yemenite jury was faithful enough to say the Rambam asked, okay, we won't go to the newspapers with it. So he knew that it's a possibility. It's always a possibility. First of all, because there were always converts. The biggest problems came from converts. That's true in Christianity. People who converted to Christianity, and they knew how to read the text, and they came up with all kinds of accusations, a lot of them false ones, about how Jews are saying bad things about their religion. But here he was clearly saying things which were very not nice towards Islam, and well, he was prepared to die at any moment. That's clear. His whole lifetime he knew that it's a possibility because of things he said, because of whatever. And as he says clearly, the truth is what guides me, and I'm not at all interested in questions of ego. And if I understand that what I said for a long, long time was wrong, I will, without hesitation, go back on that and say I made a mistake. So that's clear for the Rambam. His whole life is dedicated to the truth, and he knows he can pay with his life for it.
Okay. Is he saying that the prophets didn't need to know logic because they transcended logic?
No, they have to be logical people. They have to have the basis of wisdom.
Is that to say?
But now we are devancing things that come much later in the book. There's whole chapters in which he explains prophecy. Okay, so that's what he says. You can't be a prophet if you're not logical and wise and knowledgeable. You have to know things. You have to also have the capacity to understand, and you have to also have a whole body of knowledge.
Right, but is that knowledge different from the astronomy skills and mathematical skills that he alludes to earlier?
No. No. These are basic sciences that a prophet has. You have to take for granted that he knows that to get to because prophecy is not opposed to wisdom in the Rambam's view. It is a continuum. And a great wise person might be a prophet. Will not necessarily be a prophet, but he might be a prophet. You won't have a prophet who is not a great wise person, in the Rambam's opinion. Yeah. So where were we? Yeah. Understood as they are understood by men of culture. Men of culture understand prophecy. That's something that, is not the most fashionable thing to say in our day. But that's what the Rambam says in a very convinced way, and also in a very convincing way. I mean, this harmonious view of knowledge, wisdom, and prophecy is one of the guiding understanding lines of the Rambam. When I commenced by way of hints, now he's going on telling his pupil, when I commenced by way of hints, I noticed that you desired additional explanation, urging me to expound some metaphysical problems. To teach you the system of the mutakallimim. Okay. Well, you're smiling because you know what we're talking about? Or because you don't?
This is a new word, mutakallimim.
No, this is an Arab.
This metaphysical word is not so clear for me.
Metaphysical is not clear for you?
No.
Okay. There is the physical.
Yeah.
So, understanding medicine is physical. Understanding biology is physical. It's physics. All the sciences of nature, of this whole universe, all this is physical. But when you want to understand who guides all of this, or let's say, but since the Big Bang, I'll speak now in our words, since the Big Bang until today, all study of the universe is physical. The fraction of whatever it is of time when it is created, there you go into metaphysical. Metaphysical is beyond the physical. Okay, so that's the understanding of what is God, what is angels, what is the soul of man, the soul, what happens to the soul after death. All this is metaphysical, and that's one of the bodies of knowledge of of science and of understanding since antiquity throughout the Middle Ages.
So is that to say it's dealing with the why questions that physical sciences can't deal with?
No. That's a very modern way of saying it, of explaining it. But, when I learn Rambam, or for that matter, any medieval philosopher, I try as much as possible not I try as much as possible to go into his world, not to impose my world on his. So, for the medieval philosopher, it's not why, it's what. Just like this world is what, if I want to understand how the tree grows, it's what. The same, if I want to understand who makes eventually the tree grow, what is the cause, the first cause that brings all the causes to the end of this tree growing, what is that first cause? It's a what, it's not a why. To say it's a why is a very subjective, existentialist kind of thinking, which is where we are in the modern world. But it isn't the medieval way of thinking. The medieval way of thinking is like there is the science of the how do you say, tangible, the tangible that you see or that you feel or that you hear with your senses. Just like there is that knowledge, there's also the knowledge of the intangible, but it's just as precise. I mean, understanding that there is a first cause, which we call God, is just as precise. It's mathematical, you could say, for a medieval philosopher and for the Rambam. And that's something which is very difficult to grasp for a modern person. I mean, we're all the time in the subjective. It's all about how I feel, how my truth, my, what's the word today? My narrative.
Even more than that, many people live in, it's all about, oh, that's your truth.
Oh yeah, that's
Even more than my truth,
yeah,
it's your truth.
Totally, yeah. It's always,
Especially here in Israel.
it's, maybe especially in Israel, I don't know. I know that whenever I say something to anybody, especially the younger generation, they say, oh, but that's your opinion.
Right.
To which I respond, you didn't hear I said, so saith the Lord? You didn't hear that? In other words, what did I not say that it's God who spoke to me? Obviously it's me. I mean, what are you saying that it's me who says this? Obviously it's me who's saying this. What else would you have thought? That I'm speaking in the name of God? Did I say, so saith the Lord? Did I say that? No, I didn't. So I'm saying I say this. So what's the problem? No, you always have to precise. That's your opinion.
So is metaphysical something you accept and it's abstract?
Say that again?
Metaphysical, it's just something you accept. It's nothing you can, it's not
Tangible.
tangible.
No, but you can understand. Just like, you see, for the Rambam's world and for the whole world, since Aristotle and before him, until Newton and beyond, the whole astronomy, the whole world of beyond the moon, from the moon and beyond, is all something you couldn't see. You couldn't know anything about except through mathematics. So is it tangible or not? Well, but are you sure about it? Yes, they were sure, including about things that we know today to be false. But they were sure about it, because that's what they came to the conclusion with through mathematics. So the same thing, if somebody came to the conclusion through logic, through induction, through deduction, that God exists, that is an obvious thing. It's a truth. Just like you sense with your eye and you're sure that there is a tree over there, although in our world we know how much that could be false. It could be that there's a screen here and I think there's a tree, but there is no tree. We know that. Yet I am sure there is a tree there. So, through mathematics or through philosophy, which is an exact science. Philosophy is not speculation. It is a real science of rigorous methods of thought. You see, we're talking about a very different world to the world we live in. These are prerequisites to understand the world of the Rambam. Saying this, which is why I'm saying this. It's like an introduction to the world of the Rambam. Now let me say a few words about the mutakalemin. This is an Arabic word. So, yeah, the Rambam said, I noticed that you desired additional explanation, urging me to expound some metaphysical problems, to teach you the system of the mutakalemin. Mutakalemin comes from an Arabic word, kalam. Kalam means word, speech. Not word, speech. And since the very beginning of Islam, Islam started in a world in which there were already two religions, Judaism and Christianity, and it's on that basis that it started. One religion was despised, but had been the first religion to whom all the revelations and prophets had come, that is Judaism. And the issue of prophets is a crucial issue in Islam, very important. You can, any Muslim child, you can hear will say, the prophets, not speaking about Muhammad, the prophet, the last prophet, but the prophets, al-anbiyat, yeah, like Navi in Hebrew, the prophets, it's an issue. It's there in Arabic culture, in Muslim culture, very, very, very common. So, the prophecy being so important, Judaism having been there and being at the basis of the whole revelation of the last prophet. I mean, if you say the last prophet, you have to give importance to all that came before, because without it, it means nothing. And Christianity, which was there dominating, and which was the first power with which Islam fought. Yeah? I mean, there weren't other big powers around. There was Persia. Persia was still a power, and they fought them and they won. But anyway, the main power that they dealt with was the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire of the East, which was dominating the whole Mediterranean area and the whole Middle East, or most of the Middle East. Very early on, the Muslims saw that they had to deal with problems of the spirit. That means they came across people who said, I'm a philosopher. I don't believe in Jesus or prophets or all those things. I'm a philosopher. I believe in Aristotle's truth. I mean, that's not something that they had come across in Arabia. Might have heard about it as something foreign being there, out there somewhere. But here they had to deal with people like that. So very, very early on in Islam, they developed a whole school of having to think, having to know how to answer to philosophers. Apart from having to know how to answer to Christianity, which was the first immediate challenge, and they did that relatively easily. It's already in the Quran itself, where they say that God cannot become human, you know, God cannot have a son, God is not flesh, God is not physical, things like that which go counter Christianity. Those are the things, by the way, which are written, those verses from the Quran are written inside the dome of the rock, because that was the most important issue for them. They had to deal with this dominating empire, which was Christian. So this was the first issue. But then the issue of philosophy was a deep problem of thought. Philosophers, I mean, you can't fight them with a sword. I mean, you can cut off their heads, and of course they did that also. But still, there are books, and there are people, and there are disciples, and it's a thought that exists there. So quite quickly, what emerged is a whole school of thought that said we have to counter their arguments and know how to do this. We know we have to learn the tools of speaking. That's the mutakallimin, the speakers, basically. That's what it means literally, the speaker. So this is how the whole philosophy of Islam, the embryonic philosophy of Islam, starts there. That's what he means by the mutakallimin. That means what they came up with, all the arguments they came up with to counter the arguments of philosophy, and also the arguments of Christianity, and also of Judaism. But basically it's the whole tendency in Islam of let's be philosophical.
Will you repeat what you said about the written words in the Dome of the Rock?
Yeah, the verses, it's verses of the Quran that are written there on the dome from the inside. And the verses are verses that speak about how God is one and not three, and how God is, things that speak about the unity of God versus Christianity. Levi, are we having now the break, or how?
No, still got a few minutes.
Okay. So, urging me to expound some metaphysical problems, to teach you the system of the mutakallimin. I don't know why you write this here with an M at the end. It's with an N as the Arabic word, which it is. In Hebrew, you might say mutakallimim, maybe, but that's not how he didn't write it as mutakallimim in Hebrew. But anyways, really it's mutakallimin with an N at the end. To tell you whether the arguments were based on logical proof, that's a big question. Whether the arguments are based on logical proof, and if not, what their method was. In other words, are they just using arguments as a tool because they have preconceived faith and beliefs? That can be. Or are they really using arguments of logic? That's a big issue. I mean, whenever anybody says, I'm using arguments in order to prove a religion, then you ask yourself, if you have a critical mind, you ask yourself, wait, is it because he wants to convince me, so he's going to use arguments which he thinks will convince me, although they're not really convincing? Or are they real arguments? I mean, is he where he is because of these arguments, or is he where he is because he has whatever psychological reasons to be in that religion or faith or whatever, and then he uses them as something to convince people? That's the question that the Rambam brings up here. You see, you can often see in the Rambam things which you think are modern, not you, but I mean, often people would think, oh, that's modern. Today we know how you can, for psychological reasons, build up a whole body of arguments and all that. No, it's not new. The Rambam knew about this very well, and he deals with it. Yeah, I perceived that you had acquired some knowledge in those matters from others. You had, in other words, you, my pupil, you had learned some of these issues from other teachers, and that you were perplexed and bewildered. What it did you is that it didn't give you too much clarity, but it did give you perplexion and being bewildered. Yet you sought to find out a solution to your difficulty. I urge you to desist from this pursuit and enjoined you to continue your studies systematically. So I told you, basically, don't just go on studying a little bit here and a little bit there, but be systematic. For my object was that the truth should present itself in connected order, and that you should not hit upon it by mere chance. I wanted you to really to get to the truth in a systematical way, in a logical order. Whilst you studied with me, I never refused to explain difficult verses in the Bible or passages in rabbinic literature which we happened to meet. When by the will of God we parted and you went your way, our discussions aroused in me a resolution which had long been dormant. Your absence has prompted me to compose this treatise for you and for those who are like you, however few they may be. Basically, you are the reason I wanted to guide you through your way in life, and the few other people like you in the whole world. However few they may be, they are worth my time of writing down this book. I have divided it into chapters, each of which shall be sent to you as soon as it is completed. Farewell.
This is the introduction.
This is
Prologue.
the prologue. It's not yet the introduction to the book itself. It is the prologue of the Rambam, which he writes as a letter to this disciple, in which he says why I decided I had to sit down and write this book, because I wanted to guide you, because I saw that you were eager, you had knowledge from different sources, you needed to be guided in a systematic way, and that's why I wrote down this book. For you and for however few other people there might be who are like you.
So this was not for the population at large.
This he's going to deal with in the next part, for whom it is. He is not saying it isn't for the population at large. He's saying the first reason why he sat down and wrote it is because of what he saw the need was for this disciple and for whoever else might be in that same situation. That was the first reason. But then in the next part, he says basically it's for anybody who is in that. I'll already now tell you that I don't know if we're going to have a next session, so I'll tell you already now, in case we don't have a next session, what he says in the next part, in the introduction. He says that it's written for people who know science and who know the Torah and the faith, Jewish faith, and they are contradicting. They just don't go together. Because and they have the choice. Either they'll say Torah is talking against science and therefore I'll just discard the Torah, and that will cause them a lot of heartache and also a feeling of betrayal of a religious truth. But they'll say, I have to be convinced and to go with my conviction. Or they'll say, no, I'll just discard science and say, well, there is science, but I believe in the revealed word of God, and that's it. And then they'll also be in a heartache their whole life, because there's this knowledge that they have discarded and done away with. And the Rambam says, what I want to do is to show that they are not contradicting. And in that way, although we're talking about 12th century, and we are now very far away from that, basically that dilemma and that being torn between worlds is true of any modern man. Any modern man who's also a religious Jew, or for that matter, no, a religious Jew. I was going to say, or for that matter, any religion, but it's not true, because it is specific to Judaism. Yeah. Okay, so that will be it for now.
Cool. Thank you.